out there on our Facebook, Instagram, and other media that you're watching this. This is Busboys and Poets here in Columbia, Maryland. If you haven't been to Columbia, Maryland, it's a really beautiful space, 2 floors and lots of seats, and we'd love to have you here. It's right next to Meriwether Post Pavilion. We just opened this about 5 months ago, and the community has been loving this place. So thank you all for tuning in to be able to watch this event on this, Wednesday night. This is an event that we've been talking about for a long time. I've known Professor Chavis for some time now, and he's been telling me that he's been writing this book about the lynching of Matthew Williams here in the Eastern Shore, really just a few miles away from here, that this happened. And it didn't happen that long ago. And it's interesting to see how some of these stories are starting to come out today as we start to really sort of come to this racial reckoning that this country is going through right now. And this is certainly, these stories and these narratives that are coming out are so significant to be able to make this conversation go deeper and richer and heal us as a nation. Some people say you've got to hide the past. We believe that in order for us to move forward, we've got to uncover the past and make sure that we know where we came from. So I'll introduce our speaker, of course, our author today, and with him we have a great commentator and someone that will be talking with him, Professor Shipp. I'll introduce her in just a moment, but let me start with Dr. Professor Charles Chavis, Jr. He's an author, filmmaker, activist, and professor. Hot off the press is his book, The Silent Shore, as I mentioned to you, The Lynching of Matthew Williams and the Politics of Racism in the Free State. Bring the microphone a little bit closer to me so we can hear you better. The book has already received praise by Rosalynn Eiffel, president of NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, as a story that resonates with power and caution for our contemporary efforts to address racial violence and discrimination, she said. The Silent Shore is currently being adapted into a documentary series as well. Dr. Chavis is the director of African and African American Studies and founding director of the John Mitchell Jr. Program for History, Justice, and Race at the Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. And he's also the assistant professor of history and conflict resolution at George Mason University. Dr. Chavis is national co-chair of the United States Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Movement and vice chair of the Maryland Lynching, Truth, and Reconciliation Commission. He also serves on PBS's Exploring Hate Advisory Committee. And in conversation with Dr. Chavis is Professor Shipp. Professor Shipp is a journalist scholar with advanced degrees from Columbia University, as well as from Life, which has been no crystal stair. I love that. What is that from the poem Life's and Views? Mother to Son. Yes, indeed. And of course, this place is named after Life's and Views, Busboys and Poets. She is a founding faculty member of the School of Global Journalism and Communication at Morgan State University, where she currently directs the school's New Baltimore Reporting Project. She is a 1996 recipient of the Pulitzer Prize, considered one of the most prestigious awards in American journalism. She was the first Black woman to receive the Pulitzer in the category of commentary. Her career in journalism has taken her to the New York Times, the New York Daily News, and the Washington Post. She currently pens a bi-weekly column for the Baltimore Sun and is a frequent commentator on public radio. She is a member of the National Association of Black Journalists, the Association of Opinion Journalists, the Organization of News Ombudsmen, the Abyssinian Baptist Church in New York City, and the Open Church of Maryland. I'd like to welcome both of you, Dr. Chavis and Dr. Shipp. Thank you.
We have the microphones in our hands.
Kind of soft spoken.
I think that's fine.
Yep.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Wow.
Well, great. This is kind of fun.
You did it.
We'll see how this goes.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Chavis. So, just about 90 years ago, on March 18, 1932 to be exact, Judge Joseph Bailey declared the following. After a thoroughly energetic and complete investigation of all the evidence, direct and indirect, rumors and every lead indicated by the evidence given by more than 100 witnesses produced to us by the Attorney General, the Assistant Attorney General, the State's Attorney for Wicomico County, and members of this grand jury, we find that there is absolutely no evidence that can remotely connect anyone with the instigation or perpetration of the murder of Matthew Williams. Now, Dr. Chavis, you have produced a whole book that tells us about evidence, direct and indirect, that shows the opposite. Wow. We are going to have a good time tonight talking about the lynching of Matthew Williams and the politics of racism in the Free State. Let's start with what led you to the story of Matthew Williams in the first place?
It's a question I get all the time. First, I want to say thank you, Professor Shield, and thank you to the audience as well. All those listening from Georgia State University, thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm honored to be here in Maryland for my official book launch. But as I mentioned, I get that question a lot around why Matthew Williams. You know, when I started this work, I was a doctoral student at the Morgan State University, where you were a professor. I would teach, and it was right around the time of the first great racial uprising. And I was working at the Willie Carroll Jackson Civil Rights Museum at the time, and we had so many different students who would come into the museum. And as you have been to the museum, there's an actual replica of the NAACP flag. The man was lynched yesterday. And high school students from throughout Baltimore will oftentimes come in right around the time of the uprising. They would ask us oftentimes, you know, was Freddie Gray lynched? You know, are lynchings still happening today? Right? And so for me, as a history student, I look to history and I began to do more research and try and identify what role that lynching played in the racial climate in the state of Maryland. And what I recognized early on is that there's not a lot of focus on states such as Maryland. Maryland has around 40 documented cases of racial terror lynching. And when you look at history overall, we begin to recognize that everyone focuses on the deep south, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, exactly. But no one focuses on Maryland. And so for me, I wanted to recenter and figure out what exactly went on in Maryland. And I discovered this case, the case of Matthew Williams, that took place at a very important time in our nation's history, right at the beginning of the Great Depression.
And why his story as opposed to onward 2 years later?
Exactly. So most of the scholarship and most of the attention, even national attention, is focused directly on George Arnold. George Arnold was lynched in 1933, and his lynching was a lot more popular. It was known as the last lynching in America. Oftentimes, the last lynchings are focused on more. In this case, definitely there's a lot of evidence and there's a lot of material, but no one focused on really the origins of this racial violence and tensions around his community. And I thought, in order for us to understand what happened to George Arnold just across the county line in Somerset County, we have to understand what happened, has been happening in terms of the racial terror that's been happening to this overall community of the Lower Eastern Shore. And I discovered that there was a pattern beginning in the mid-1920s of racial terror that was happening, specifically targeted at the black community of the Lower Eastern Shore. And so it didn't begin with George Arnold. George Arnold was really a sign and representation of what was already going on, but had been overlooked. Professor Sherilyn Eichel, in talking to her about some of this research and talking to her about the work of the Lynching Commission, she talked about making sure that those who didn't get away with the crime don't get a pass, right? And so oftentimes we focus on those who got away with the lynching, got away with this racial violence and murder, but we overlook the terror that was caused as well. And so I wanted to utilize the story of Matthew Williams, salvage his humanity, and show that this is a part of a direct line of racial terror and continuum that we tend to overlook.
But that period of time, there was a lot of this racial terror going on anyway. We had the Red Summer of 1919 after World War I concluded, and you had a number of black soldiers returning home, and they became convenient targets. Also, the Great Migration was underway with lots of blacks leaving the Deep South for parts north and Midwest and West, and all of that led to racial terrorism throughout the country. So what was happening in the Eastern Shore that was a part of that kind of terrorism or was different from that?
Well, one of the things that I uncovered in my research, but also is really consistent across the board in terms of my own thesis, I look at the ways in which economic strife and economic turmoil correlate to upticks in racial violence. And so, when we look at the history of racial terror and racism in this country, if we look to some of the most contentious economic situations, we often see an uptick in racial terror, right? So, for example, post-Reconstruction, after slavery, we see, during Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction, after slavery, we see the rise of the Klan. We see all these groups emerging as the South is trying to rebuild and rebuild its economy. We also see an uptick in racial terror lynchings in the 1890s at the turn of the 20th century. And then again, what gets overlooked is this equally as contentious economic climate, which is the Great Depression, which is marked by the stock market crash of 1929. There's also another uptick of racial terror that emerges during that period, and Maryland, in many ways, is at the center of that, with the two popular cases of Matthew Williams and George Allwood. But also what the book reveals is, again, the terror that's overlooked, that's not, it doesn't make it to the newspapers and the front pages. That's overlooked, and I think for me, my goal was to salvage the humanity of this community and shine a light on the direct connection and correlations between these more popular acts that are documented and the everyday racial terror that black communities continue to face.
What specifically was going on in the Eastern Shore?
Sure. So at this time, you, believe it or not, like what a lot of people don't realize, we think about Tulsa in terms of these black business districts or communities. And in fact, the Eastern Shore had a very strong black business class as well as black educators. As you know, or as most people should know, one of the things that the book lays out is the history of education on the Maryland Eastern Shore, specifically the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, which is a college, an HBCU, that dates back to the 1890s.
It's part of Morgan.
Yes, part of Morgan State University, Princess Anne Academy. And so you have prominent black educators, as well as other black leaders and black businesses. And in doing the research on Matthew Williams, what I discovered is that the attack and the lynching of Matthew Williams was really utilized as a way to stifle the economic, political, and social success of the black community of Salisbury. And there was a specific community or neighborhood known as Georgetown. And this is the community that Matthew Williams was a part of. And so this community during the Great Depression was finding a way to thrive and survive in spite of. And part of my argument is that this bred animus and anger regarding whites in the community, poor white laborers and others, who saw this black business district emerging and thriving in the midst of the Great Depression. So from the evidence I'm able to uncover, it becomes very clear that there is indeed jealousy amongst members of the white community, and Matthew Williams is utilized as what Sherilyn Eichel calls, in many ways, Lynching's message crimes. He's utilized to put the black community, this black business district, on notice.
We've seen that in various parts of the country. You mentioned Tulsa, we've seen Rosewood in Florida. And what you just described reminds me of even what Ida B. Wells dealt with in Memphis when her career as a crusader against lynching began when 3 prominent black men in that community were lynched to send a message because they had a very successful grocery store. And so we've seen that pattern over and over again. But when you came onto this story, as I began, I said, Judge Bailey said there was no evidence after all this thorough investigation. So how did you start to unravel this, starting with there's no evidence? How did you begin the process of finding a different truth?
Well, it really begins with not accepting the lie, right? So even in terms of what we know about lynching scholarship and scholarship of racial terrorism throughout the U.S., we oftentimes are left with this myth that lynchings took place at the hands of persons unknown. And in talking with and having conversations with the descendants of victims of racial terror lynchings, it becomes quite clear that it was known amongst the community and black communities throughout this country, even when we think about the memories associated with Tulsa and other acts of racial terror, right? Everyone, in terms of the legal system and the law, it never really is on our side, but the stories are still there. And so one of the things I wanted to do as a historian, I wanted to really search out, seek out as much evidence as I could find to corroborate the truths that communities, not just in Salisbury, throughout this country, have shared about their experiences with racial terror. And so I decided to go on this journey. And based on what we know about most racial terror lynchings, as you know, as someone involved in the black press and understanding the media, most of what we know about lynchings is all documented in newspaper accounts. And so I utilized the newspaper accounts, specifically the amazing coverage of the Baltimore Afro-American, to then seek out additional investigative materials that, for all intents and purposes, should have been located at Maryland State Archives, which is where most municipal records, legal records for states are held. And so I went there and I just hung out for a little bit until I was able to stumble upon something.
Tell us a little bit about that process, because you go there and you're finding that there are no records where they should have been records. There are empty folders where they should have had something in them.
Yes, and so that experience is one of the experiences I talk about in the book. And this is actually while I was a doctoral student at Morgan. I'm in between classes. I teach also at Anne Arundel Community College at the time. And I remember going in between my classes to go and do some research. And looking at the newspaper accounts, I noticed that there were a number of references to records and materials of the Attorney General and the State's Attorney. And so I began to call up and look for those records, call up the records for the State's Attorney and other officials who were named publicly in the newspaper. And as soon as I did that, I actually called up and I requested the records for 1931 through 1934, specifically the records of the Maryland Interracial Commission. When I knew, because of the Afro-Americans coverage, newspapers coverage, I knew that there was an investigation that had taken place, in part through the leadership of the Interracial Commission. And so those are the records that I looked for. And I went searching for those specific records of the commission. And to my astonishment, in the years of 1931 to 1934, those boxes were empty.
And you knew that could be the story.
Exactly. So for me, it's almost like when a dog is on the hunt, right? It's like, I'm going to keep looking, because this is, so actually at that point, I called down someone who's become a dear friend of mine, Chris Haley, who's a nephew of Alex Haley from the Maryland State Archives. I'm like, Mr. Haley, what is this? Like, what is going on? Where are these records? He was just as sharp as I was. And for me, that's when I began to reflect and reset and begin to, again, continue to fight and continue to hunt. I knew there was something there. I didn't necessarily believe that, records were destroyed, but I think in terms of the process of, the ways in which archival institutions fail to recognize the importance of the records and materials associated with marginalized communities, I know that they weren't a priority, right? And so that definitely was the case with the state archives. And so as a result of that neglect, these records were literally off, the records that I would end up finding were off-site in storage facilities.
How did you finally identify the records that you found out to be somewhere else?
So there was an 850-page document, PDF, that listed unprocessed collections. And I went through that document page by page and found investigation files from the Attorney General. Right? And that's pretty much how it was listed. And I saw the years that corresponded to lynching of 1931, 1933. I pulled those boxes. It took 4 days for them to get there because they were stored off-site. Because the collection in Maryland's state archive is so vast, they have to store things off-site. And, you know, even in terms of the scope of what they're kind of, the history they're covering, is important to understand, too, going back to the 1600s. And really, so 4 days it took me to get those documents. And of course, I made sure that Mr. Haley was there with me when they came in. And I was just floored. Photographs from the investigation, over 50 interviews for eyewitnesses, contemporaneous interviews from eyewitnesses that were taken. I also discovered, to my amazement, a journal from an undercover Pinkerton detective agent.
Is that Patsy?
Patsy Johnson.
Yeah.
And, you know, just to kind of give you an idea of what I had to go through, because the records weren't processed. They were literally...
They were just literally in the boxes.
It was actually a Home Depot box, a moving box. I say Home Depot because I'm in moving a lot, during my college career.
So you know the
I
boxes.
know it was a Home Depot box. I never did it. Medium-sized Home Depot.
But how were they cared for?
Thrown
And
on top of each other.
protected?
Yeah, they were thrown
Oh,
on
wow.
top of each other. So, and the archivist at the time who had been there before explained to me the process, right? He explained to me that literally what ends up happening. Technically, all state agencies are supposed to turn over records at a certain point to the state archive. But he explained to me really what ends up happening. You have local storage, and local offices have their own storage. And after they get tired of looking at things, or the clutter, they will take what's in those old file cabinets and dump them into these boxes and send them to the archive. And that's exactly what seemed to be the case, because literally all of the files documented the investigation, also discovered receipts from and invoices from the Pinkerton detective agents between that and the governor who was paying for this secret investigation, because he knew that the local officials were complicit in the lynching.
I want to get back to that in a minute, but so there was nothing nefarious in the fact that these files were listed as restricted. It was just sort of this incompetent system.
That's what that's an official institutional response.
What do you think?
Well, I think when we look at the political careers of the individuals who would end up becoming governor, Preston Lane, and others, I think this is something that needed to be hidden. In order for Preston Lane, even the bridge we have named after him, that really, what people say in Maryland, it connected two worlds that were so distant apart. This bridge, the Bay Bridge, he's known as a heroine figure in many ways in Maryland state history. And so their histories and legacies would have been forever tarnished if this was ever released. And so I think that has a lot to do with it, but the process also does not speak to, again, like I mentioned, salvaging and making sure that the records of the most oppressed people like me are prioritized. And so, I wasn't too surprised. Chris Haley was definitely surprised, and so it was a very difficult experience, specifically having to go through those records. And I took great care. I digitized all these materials. I then digitized them, saved files and everything, and I processed the collection as well.
So you did a service for the state.
Correct.
You have done the state some service. Isn't that was something like that?
Yeah. So I did that, and I actually gave them the files directly to Chris Haley, and Chris Haley, as far as I know, has kept those in lock and key right next to him.
Well, you mentioned some characters, and I want to get to some of the characters, because some are quite colorful and some are mysterious still. Let's start with Governor Ritchie. Governor Ritchie had ambitions to become president of the United States. I've seen him described in some places as conservative, in some places as progressive. But tell me what you concluded about Richie, and how would you characterize his response to this lynching? Because it happened when he was getting ready to run for president.
Exactly. So Richie is an interesting character. He's a political giant and a masterful politician. So for me, I think Richie, and when I talk about in the book, specifically in that chapter, Richie is trying to utilize the black vote and trying to use this lynching to secure the black vote. He's trying to use this as an opportunity to secure the black vote for a hopeful presidential bid, where he's hoping to again galvanize the black vote. And so,
by just announcing that he's doing something, or by actually doing something?
Well, just by announcing it, right? Because when we look at Richie, who's a Democrat, he's really trying to distance himself because of Hoover's failure. It's like, the thing about the politics of, just to give context. So Hoover's Republican.
President Hoover, Herbert Hoover.
Exactly. President Herbert Hoover's Republican. He's doing a horrible job with the Great Depression. And Richie is hoping that a progressive Democrat such as himself will allow, his role in Baltimore and working in Maryland with this large black community, finding a way to be successful in the state that has a large black community. He's hoping that that'll provide him with enough of a track record to move up towards a presidential bid.
And that involves the Maryland Interracial Commission?
Exactly. So early on, beginning in 1924, Richie appears on the cover of Time magazine as a presidential hopeful. And around that time, he begins to clearly and directly court the black vote through a number of strategic endorsements and partnerships. Specifically, he receives, in one year he receives an endorsement from the Baltimore Afro-American. He also is speaking at Morgan State and talking about providing resources to HBCUs. And then you have also, the lynching was almost like a perfect storm for Richie. He was actually in Chicago attempting to court black voters there when he got the announcement. And this is where he, once he gets the announcement, the call on the night of the lynching, he gives his full-throated, bold response that his executive leadership and authority is going to be able to stamp out the scourge of lynching in Maryland, but also he wants it to be symbolic for what he can do nationally. So Richie was very much so states' rights, right? So he was against this national legislation around anti-lynching. He felt that it's not a Congress with such a strong executive leader, right? And he felt that if he had the opportunity, he wanted to use the lynching of Matthew Williams to really, again, court the black vote and show the broader public,
To show that states' rights could work for them if the state really did take seriously what was going on.
Right.
But let's remind people, in case everybody listening so into the politics of the United States, black people were strongly Republican, those who could vote, that is, were strongly Republican still. And they had been disenchanted with the Republicans for quite a while. Even in the 1920 presidential election, they were thinking about maybe going towards the Democrats. There was a strong move to get them to go towards the Socialist Party, but they ultimately stayed with the Republicans in 1920, and they were still trying to figure out where they were going to go. So Richie would have had a hard time, probably nationally, winning over black Democrats. So maybe he was hoping the Marylanders would kind of show the way for other black folks too. So he appoints this Pinkerton detective. Tell us about how, I mean, in some ways I sort of thought you had become a Pinkerton detective yourself because you had to find out this stuff. So tell us how Richie comes up with this patsy dude.
So it's interesting because I actually, as my niece would say, follow the receipts. And so,
in journalism, we say follow the money.
Okay, listen. And so when I began to look at these records, some of the things that intrigued me were the receipts and the invoices between the Pinkerton agency and Richie, as well as Attorney General. And so, as I mentioned, what we know because of the Afro is that there was an investigation. The judge talks about how we interviewed all these witnesses and all this stuff. So that's all public, right? What I was able to discover was the actual statements that the governor, the judge and others are referring to, right? So those statements. But so Richie commissioned, right, this public-facing investigation. But I believe, based on what we know about his political aspirations, that Richie was quite aware of the ways in which locals and state officials, specifically state attorney, were involved in this lynching, which is very consistent with what we know about racial terror lynchings throughout history. We have over 6,500 or more cases of racial terror lynchings, and for the most part, these lynchings are state sanctioned. And so
6,500?
6,500, the newest number from EJI, and around that. And so
EJI is Equal
Justice Initiative. Yes. And so, Richie is really concerned with making sure that he has the politics together around this. So, he wants the real story to be that he's figured it out. But the thing is, as Richie gets into this investigation, and as Patrick Johnson gets in, Richie recognizes that if this is to ever get out, then everything that I want to do with this case and utilize this case for is going to go down the drain because I have no legitimacy. How can I handle one case of racial terror lynching in Maryland and use that to justify being able to handle racial terror lynching nationally when I can't even deal with and put one state's attorney in check and his uncle who's a judge in this small community, right? And so at that point is where Richie decides to fold the investigation, and we never hear about this investigation at all.
Which again leads to this silence. You talk about the conspiracy of silence, but you also, who is complicit in this conspiracy of silence?
Well, our text would call it the system of silence, and so Professor Eichel talks about conspiracy of silence, but in doing the research and being able to unmask members of the mob whose descendants are alive to this day, right, who we know about. And I think that's something also that's important. When I decided to do this book, I decided to lay out the truth and put it out. I didn't use pseudonyms for those family members. And as I begin to engage with the community early on, specifically the activists who I talk about in the book, James, Yamakawa, and Amber Green, when I showed them the materials early on throughout this process, they began to recognize the names of people in the community who still have local political and social power, specifically power over a large portion of the marginalized community, the Black community in Salisbury and the Eastern Shore. And so at that point, I had to make a decision as to how much I would lay out there and lay bare to the public, as I knew this would probably be a part of a community's work towards healing and justice. And so that was a very difficult decision for me to undertake.
And how did you resolve the conflict about how much to expose and what to be more circumspect about?
I just, after much reflection and talking with the local activists, as well as eventually connecting with the descendants, collateral descendants of Matthew Williams, or relatives of Matthew Williams, I decided to go full through and put it out there, full throttle and put it out there. Because part of the thing, as I mentioned earlier on, we allow this lie to live and thrive, this lie that thousands of people somehow were present at these lynchings, but nobody saw them. Right. We allow the lies to live on, and I could not any longer allow the lie to live on within my work. And I think Black communities who have suffered historically this type of racial trauma, who recall this type of racial trauma, who talk about it, whose stories have not been honored, I had to put the records out there and let them know, as well as the world know, that the evidence, if we have access to the evidence and to the records, it will corroborate the truths that Blacks have been talking about for hundreds of years in terms of their experiences with racial terror.
You know, you talk about in the book these 5 circles of culpability, I guess, right? So, and as you're naming names and saying who is more responsible and who's less responsible, say something about these 5 circles and how you place the participants in these circles and what that means about their roles.
Sure. And so the framework that I developed was actually a framework from the FBI. And Howard Sneed, who's a professor at UMBC, actually wrote a book a while back called Blood Justice. And in that book, he talks about these layers of conspiracy. When we think about mobs you know, it's very interesting because even when we think about January the 6th, what I talk about in the book, there's so many layers in knowledge, right? You have people who are part of the frenzy, so when they hear about it, they run to go see, you know, are they culpable, are they complicit? So what I wanted to do is really figure out the ways in which we can categorize and make sense of this from a legal standpoint in terms of determining culpability and guilt, right? And so this structure that I developed, again, is a law based on what we know about mob psychology and the ways in which we can easily determine where people would fit, right? And so I was a historian who was really salvaging these stories, and I call it forensic reconstruction. I took all of these narratives and reconstructed the story based on all this evidence. And so I had to find a place for individuals to go within that structure, to make sense of it from a legal standpoint and from a justice standpoint. And so, you know, that was very difficult for me, especially having to go through over and over again the statements. Right? Specifically, what was most helpful was Patsy Johnson's investigation. And this is where we find out that, remember, I'm dealing with two sets of records. So I'm dealing with what, you know, when you think of, when you watch Law and Order or other shows, you have the interrogation in the room with, say, the attorneys or the officers. So I had the equivalent to those records that I was dealing with, an abundance of those records and those interviews. Then I also had a secret journal, 3 months of Patsy Johnson. So this is where he's undercover, and things that were excluded from those interrogation-based interviews early on were open to the, like they were just open and freely talking about what they did to Matthew Williams and what they were going to do to the overall black community. And this is where names begin to come out. So we discovered that the fire chief provided the rope that is actually housed at the National, a piece of the rope is housed at the National Museum of African History and Culture. Fred Greer, who was the fire chief at the time, provides the rope to Matthew Williams. We learned of others as well. We learned of the chief of police who was involved, the sheriff. All of these individuals who just, you know, months before told the state's attorney they had no clue. But we actually learned their role in this lynching. And the mask comes off and their identities are revealed. We also learned of the individual that actually poured the gasoline on Matthew Williams. He actually befriends Patsy and is very bold in his conversations with Patsy.
How did Patsy get people to open up to him? Because he was an outsider. So why are they telling him all this stuff?
Exactly. That was something that a lot of people wrestle with in terms of, you know, with the book. And that's something I had to discover. And so we really don't know who Patsy, we would never know who Patsy was. Because the way the Pinkerton Detective Agency is structured, and I did all my due diligence, I actually reached out to the Pinkerton Detective Agency, because it's still an agency. It started as out of the organization that really was the precursor to the Civic Service. So the Pinkerton Agency started right around the time of Lincoln's first assassination attempt. And they began to develop this craft around, you know, private investigations, infiltration, things like that. And so they had a unique system and approach that was very secret and cryptic. And even in the journal that I discovered, Patsy Johnson was never named. It had it listed as a number. It was actually, his name was BJ, and it was his report. And so that's all I had. And so eventually I went through the records and I was able to decode the journal and discover his identity. And it became clear and made sense to me how he was able to establish his cover. So Patsy Johnson, what we discovered, was actually a former prize fighter. And he had been up and down Virginia's Eastern Shore boxing, but also he had been traveling throughout the world boxing. Very successful boxer. He was known as one sports commentator to be able to take a beat. You know, so exactly. So that was interesting.
So you had a little bit of celebrity.
Yes.
And so people probably, guys, like to hang out with
Exactly.
in the gym, at the bar, and once you're doing all that, you just start telling stories.
Exactly.
That kind of thing.
And so with that background, he was able to establish cover because there was a growing prize fighter and fighter group that was emerging in the Eastern Shore region. And with Ocean City being very close to Salisbury, there was a lot of gambling and betting going on around this time. And remember, if we look at the time period, this is around the time of Al Capone. All of these individuals Ocean City is actually a starving ground for mobsters and others, and there's money in boxing because of gambling. And so Patsy
Still
comes,
is.
exactly. And so Patsy comes to the shore, being a former boxer, and he's comes and he's saying, look, I want to start a gym in Salisbury, and that's his cover. And so he comes in, and all of the individuals who are involved are prize fighters who are amateur trying to make a name for themselves. And so that's his cover.
That would be interesting if Walter White had done something like that. But Walter White could not get away with being a boxer. He's a little too sophisticated. But Walter White was an NAACP official, black man, but he was so fair-skinned that he sometimes went undercover to learn what was going on among white people who were plotting against black folks. Are we doing on time? We're good? Okay, just give me signals when you want me to start wrapping things up. So, who do you put in those circles beyond the one you just told us? Those would be in the first circle.
Exactly.
Right. As you're moving out, where do you place other people?
So some others, as we go further out, we have individuals who stood there and did nothing, right? For example, right? And so they would go out. They would go later on in terms of the circle. One of the parallels I draw in the book, specifically when we think about the continuation of anti-black violence, is how one of the statements that really struck me was a statement from one of the officers that we received, and he talked about actually, why he did nothing, and pretty much directed traffic. The state's attorney at the time asked him, the attorney general asked him during his interview, he said, what were you thinking? Why were you not trying to get the body away from the mob? And he said, at the time, I thought the most humane thing to do was direct traffic. And automatically, whenever I thought about that, I remember seeing what happened most recently, this past year, the situation with George Floyd, and how the officers were sitting around and almost protecting the scene, allowing this officer to do this. It seemed like in many ways making directing traffic, right? And so for me, this legacy of black victimization and this constant onslaught of anti-black violence, specifically connected to at the hands of the police, is something that I saw as a direct connection. And I think when we think about individuals who stand by and do nothing, specifically when they're charged with upholding the law.
They were protect and serve.
Exactly. And so they have to fit within that circle. And so for me, it was very important for me to include those as well, but also others who may have been a part of the process, who knew about it beforehand, because this lynching was pre-planned. What I discovered early on is that most people traditionally think that these lynchings are sporadic, but we know that it's premeditated, it's pre-planned, and there's a structure to it. It wasn't something that was random. Another lie that's told around lynchings is a lie that people came from out of town. It's always the outsiders.
And they even investigated the socialists.
Exactly.
And the agitators.
And that was one of the lies that was told as well, that we don't have any issues with our blacks on the Eastern Shore. It's the socialist groups that are coming in trying to stir up trouble with our black community. And that was a lie that was told. But again, I think the main threat, the reason why Matthew Williams was targeted, is because of the success of the black community on the Eastern Shore. I briefly talked about Georgetown, where Matthew Williams is from, this black business district. Now, I just want to give you an idea of the damage that's been done in this community even to this day. So at the time of Matthew Williams' lynching, there were around 19 black businesses and homes in the Georgetown neighborhood district. To this day, there's only one building that remains. That's the Charles Chipman Cultural Center, which is the former church that Matthew Williams attended. And it's also one of the oldest wooden structures in Maryland Eastern Shore, built by former slaves in the 1830s. Even the black bodies of the Georgetown Community Cemetery were exhumed to make way for highway expansion. And again, this is directly correlated and begins, this direct assault on the black community begins with this lynching. And within the statements and within the evidence that I uncovered, it is very clear that Matthew Williams is really the victim of, he's pretty much who they get their hands on. It's very clear in the statements. They're very clear that blacks have been getting away with so much on the Eastern Shore. They even have communist attorneys representing them. And they think that they can have a taste of justice. So it didn't matter who it was.
You're going to put them in their place.
Exactly. and that's very consistent again with what we see happening in other states as well. Tulsa, I think people overlook Tulsa. We see the massacre and we think about the massacre that took place, but there's also the systemic displacement, an attempt to destroy Black communities that continues after these acts of racial terror. And that's why I think it's equally as important for us to talk about as we talk about what racial healing and justice looks like now. Right? People oftentimes talk about the Tulsa Massacre and what happened in 1921, but they fail to recognize and talk about the strategic efforts in displacement attempts. After Tulsa was to rebuild, just like after Salisbury we were trying to rebuild, after Georgetown we were trying to rebuild, there would be these systemic acts, specifically through displacement, land dispossession to dismantle these communities.
And we still see that going on. Did Black people in Salisbury area keep the story of John Williams alive, or did they also try to suppress the story?
Well, as Shady Shields, who's actually her uncle, her grandfather, witnessed the lynching, was a classmate of 50 years. And she talks about, why there's so much silence. And this is something that Professor Eichel ran up against in her work. Why would members of the Black community not talk about this? Right? And when you begin to study and recognize the power dynamics at play, it becomes very clear why Black people in this community, kept getting it. It didn't really leave their living rooms in many ways, around specifically the identity of those involved. You can't lie and say it never happened, but in terms of the memories, indeed there's different expression. And I think it had a lot to do with fear, because as I mentioned, what we now know is that a lot of the people whose family members were involved in these lynchings hold political and economic power over this community to this day. Even to this day.
And so you had people who knew what went on, Black people knew what went on, but they had to go to work the next day for these people.
Exactly.
So there's not so much you could do in that context.
Exactly. That's exactly how Ms. Shady Shields describes it. These were their employers. So how do we saw them, yes we saw them. From our windows, when we had to hire, we saw all of them, our employers, right? And it's like, what do we do? How are we going to survive? Because we're already finding a way to survive in the midst of the Great Depression. But then, once we can speak out, what will happen to us? And so Shady Shields and her descendants represent members of the community, the Black community who found a way to survive and thrive. But there are also other figures whose story I'm able to uncover, specifically the great-grandfather of actually Jada Pinkett Smith. And so this story, the actress, yes. He's actually a professor at UMES at the time. And
don't call it that. It wasn't called that in 1920.
Oh, Morgan College. I'm sorry. She wants to be Morgan State. It was Princess Anne Academy, at the time of the campus of Morgan State University. He was a professor there. He also worked in a hotel, and he also witnessed the lynching. And in doing the investigation, we've never known the story, but in doing the investigation, I looked through the notes from the state's attorney as well as the actual notes from the investigation, and he emerges as a figure who names members of the mob in open court. But because the grand jury proceedings are hidden and secret, we would have never known. But I had the notes from the state's attorney documenting how he named members of the mob, as well as another figure.
And what did they do with that information? How
they threw it in a box.
and waiting for you to find it. Another hero is Dr. Brown.
Yes.
So tell us about Dr. Brown, who you describe as having a protected status, and he also had a lot of courage. So tell us who he was.
Dr. A.D. Brown was also an HBCU grad. He was a graduate of Shaw University at the time, medical school. He ended up in Baltimore after going to Atlanta and then being in Baltimore. He ended up on the Eastern Shore shortly thereafter. He was the sole Black physician in the region. And he also was very militant, as a lot of people describe. He was the central witness for the state, and he would name members of the mob as well. And he actually was the only individual whose account we have, who actually saw the initial crime that was alleged to have happened to justify the lynching, right? And so Dr. Brown is another one of those figures who's a physician, and I think it's because of his protective status is one of the reasons why he's able to navigate the system. He also drives directly through the mob. And I wanted to make sure to clear this up as well, because everyone's like, how do you drive through the mob? it wasn't until recently that I did an interview with Ms. Shady Shields, and I discovered that it was actually Dr. Amy Brown who actually birthed Ms. Shields and a number of people in the Black community. And when I showed her these documents, and I was like, I couldn't figure out, Ms. Shields, how did Dr. Amy Brown, this man, how did he drive through the mosque? And she said, Dr. Brown? She said, oh, he passed. He got one people of life. Like, and I was like, wow. So for me, it made so much sense. And I'm learning so much more about Dr. Brown. And we've actually identified his sons, and we'll be interviewing them as well in March for the film series based on the book.
That sounds great. We're now being told we need to wrap up. So what do you want readers to take away from this episode and the ensuing silences that went on? What do you want us to know about this, and how does it connect to today?
Yeah, I want us to really begin to, as a country, embrace the truth, right? And there's an attack on, we have this whole myth and this Trojan horse of critical race theory that they're trying to throw out there to say that don't teach us in schools. But I think the real assault attack is on the truth, specifically the truth and the lived experiences that Black and brown people have faced throughout this country, right? It complicates American history, but it is the truth around our history. So we have to be able to embrace that and acknowledge it. And so for me, I hope this work helps us to begin on that path towards truth. And as a country, we have a tendency to overlook and go around these traumatic episodes. But with this work, I wanted to lay everything out there and lay it bare. And I wanted to allow this community, as well as the state, to have an opportunity to reckon with this history and find the true path towards justice. Acknowledgement is very important, and really that's the first step. And I'm thankful that the city of Salisbury actually, due to some of the work and research I've been able to do, along with activism, established a truth commission based on some of this material that's been uncovered. And so, we have to begin to, when we think about justice and we think about healing and all these grand ideas, truth has to be first, right? And so, for me, I hope that this book shows the importance of embracing that truth and acknowledging that truth.
Great. I thank you very much. I think it's a great book. I'm looking forward to reading it very carefully, page by page. And I'll tell you more about what I think about it.
No, I don't care. But thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good. Sorry, y'all. You take your mic, my dear. You do so much to make sure it doesn't trip you up.
Hello, hello. And so now is the time for the Q&A, and you just had such incredible questions. You literally took mine out of my mouth there. So while I let you all simmer and ponder, because this is a really deep and heavy topic, you mentioned the Reconciliation Committee. What would that look like for you? I know we've seen that, not here in the United States quite yet, but in Canada, there have been a lot of proponents and then people who are like, this isn't enough. So I guess my question to you is, what would you want to see that we have already seen in the world today, and how can we go that extra mile?
Yeah, I think we have to really understand in terms of, thank you for your question, we have to understand the ways in which America is different in many ways from what we see in terms of the global commissions. Right? So we have an issue in America, as I mentioned, embracing and recognizing the ways in which our nation in many ways is conceived in systemic racism, anti-blackness, right, and sexism. And we have an issue with embracing that. Right? So the whole idea of reconciliation, I argue, gets me in trouble oftentimes. It's problematic when we think about it in an American context. This is one of the reasons why we focus on and emphasize and utilize Dr. Gail Christopher's framework, which is the truth, racial healing, and transformation, not reconciliation, which is the more popular. Right? Transformation is something that is locally led, right, and that really is about a process. So we're not leaping towards reconciliation with these lofty goals. It's about, number one, dealing with the truth, embracing that truth, acknowledging that truth, dealing with it, sitting in the messiness of that truth, and finding a way to embrace each other's shared humanity. And then from there, if we're able to get that done, we can also begin to have a real conversation about what social transformation looks like. And for me, in terms of the work of the community, the best examples of true restorative justice and transformative justice work is at the local level. And something that is very important to the work that we're doing, the work that's happening in Salford, its descendants are directly connected to the process, right? You have descendants that are directly involved. So when you think about other models, that's not necessarily the case. But one of the things that I would not give up on in my work and research, I would not close it out until I identify those who lost their loved ones, right? When we think about any conversation around justice, they have to be at the table. And so the Salford Commission, one of the things that we made sure of with the mayor's support was that descendants are represented on that committee, as well as all of the local law enforcement and other officials whose legacy, right, is tied to the corrupt and criminal actions that led to Matthew Mills' death.
I love that you use the word corrupt. Not enough folks go that extra mile, but that's exactly what we're seeing. And now turning over to the audience, do we have any questions, any takers, any comments? I know it's a heavy topic, y'all. It's okay. Yeah.
So, Doctor, how do you see the history that you've put together as it applies in today's scope of issues that are occurring, whether it's victims, crime that we've seen, and I think we've seen some of your other earlier interviews, or just crime and how victims are treated all the way around?
Yeah, I think to your point, the victimization piece is very important. And so when we look at the anti-Black violence of old, specifically anti-Black violence, racial terror lynching, there's definitely a direct line that we can see to what we continue to witness. The victimization is very important. It's Black victimization. When you think about systemic racism, it's important to think about outcomes. And when we look at outcomes, specifically regarding the deaths of people of color, specifically Black and brown people at the hands of police, the numbers tell it all, specifically unarmed. Right, most of the data that I've looked at is focused on specific unarmed situations. And one of the things that I uncovered right around the Freddie Gray uprising in the case, I began to look back into history 100 years earlier, 1915. And what I discovered was that there were more police killings of unarmed Black men in 2015 than there were lynchings of Black men in 1915. Right, and so, you know, there's so much debate about the definition. You know, what is lynching? Why are you lumping these things into lynching? And I think we have to be very careful because when we center on a definition, we allow for exclusion to take place. And the real issue of this anti-Black violence that comes in multiple forms, it produces the same outcomes, whether it was a mob that did it or whether a gun or bullet did it. The outcome is the same. And even to this day, I would argue that the unarmed killing of Black men and Black women is far more lethal in many ways at the hands of police using the system than that of lynching everyone.
How are you defining modern day lynching? You had to do that.
So modern day lynching are the police killings that I described specifically at the hands of unarmed Black people in this country. However, there's definitely overlap in a number of ways. I would say that what we see in terms of in terms of George Floyd and others at the hands of police, those are modern day forms of lynching. I would argue, and again, historians and theorists debate about it. I argue that Ahmaud Arbery wasn't lynched, and I believe that his case should be included and added to the over 6,000, as I mentioned, numbers that I mentioned before. Right? But I think for the cases of anti-Black violence and murders that we see historically and to this day at the hands of police, those are modern day forms of lynching. And something that I talk about in the book that's very controversial. I use a quote from the artist Dred Scott, who actually created a replica of the Man Was Lynched Yesterday flag, and it's actually the words read, "A man was lynched by the police yesterday." And he made a very provocative comment and said that the inheritors of electronic terror are the police. And I sat with that, right, that quote, and reflected on it. And as someone who values the role of law enforcement and the importance of, proper law enforcement and law, and justice, I wrestled with that. And for me, it makes so much sense what he's describing, right? And I think part of the problem is in terms of the way we approach policing. When we suppress the truth, when we suppress this history, specifically the detailed decision-making and processes that law enforcement officers back in the day, like in the 30s and 40s, all these things we have access to, how they were thinking, their process. Why do we not show this truth, this history, and use it to inform trainings that we do with officers to this day? Because when officers specifically, when police officers oftentimes interact with the black community, it's an interaction that is not in many ways informed and understood based on the legacy of terror, right? So there's a terror that runs through, and fear that runs through a number of people throughout the black community when they have these interactions. And these interactions are based on true experiences that have been lived by their ancestors. And if we suppress those and invalidate them, then how are we ever going to try to inform policing when the true role of law enforcement in these roles and that relationship has been so fractured?
What has been the response of the descendants of both the Matthew Williams family on that side, but also the descendants of the mob?
Wow. So up until this point, we've identified the descendants of the mobs, and we will be doing interviews with the descendants of the mobs in March. So that'll be our first time. We've actually partnered with Living and Growing, which is a social work firm out of Baltimore, to begin to work with not only the descendants of the perpetrators, but also the individuals, the victims as well. And so we've taken our time throughout this process to engage with social work, because based on what I know about a lot of these figures who we're going to be reaching out to, and it's important to know that also the mayor as well is going to be sending a letter to a lot of these families who show up in these my investigation book. So that's something that is very difficult. But my original conversation with Ms. Jeannie Jones, who's actually a native DC, former producer out of DC, and she's actually a descendant of Matthew Williams. And I recall that experience and having a conversation with her. She was absolutely shocked. All she had known was that her family left to go to DC, for better jobs. But
She knew the connection to him, though, or did she not even know that?
she didn't know that. She knew that her family's from Salisbury. And
But none of the reason
none of
why
the
they
reason,
left.
none of the reason why. Which is consistent with what most of us think about the Great Migration. The lie that's often told is that we were leaving because of jobs and economic opportunity, when in reality we were escaping and we were refugees, escaping terror.
There was an episode of that in my home state in Georgia, 1946. Two married couples were lynched in Walton County, Georgia, and a number of activists, labor union people, and others in the north sent money to help black people leave from that area. So a whole lot of people left there, moving northwards. And there are other places too you can equate with where EJI has found lynching. You can find that migration gained some impetus for that reason.
Well, thank you both so much. I do have one last question for both of you, and I'll give you the mic back. So this is, I would say, almost like a booming field in academia right now, looking at suppressed histories, looking at racial trauma, and really trying to just uncover it all and shed light on it, especially right now in this time of racial reckoning. What do you two do as academics, as Black people, as people who have to navigate this sphere? How do you keep your joy going? How do you not burn out? And I ask this for all the academics out there who will probably end up watching this.
Thank you very much.
I'll answer that first. So I would say first, prayer. A man of faith has been very important for me dealing with a lot of this trauma, but also counseling, not missing any of my counseling appointments. And this is, again, I started this book 5 or 6 years ago when I was a doctoral student. So I was dealing with all the issues of being a doctoral student in the humanities, which is underfunded and we need support more of. And, I was struggling doing this work in addition to having to recover this trauma. So, definitely counseling, also the support of my lovely wife and my family. Who's here. Keeping me humble all the time, but always keeping me on track. And I'm just really thankful for the family support, because I definitely would not have been able to do it. The lonely nights with these records,
You're the only one who's seen these records
I'm
at
the
90
only one
years.
in 90 years, like holding all that was really difficult. But I really got a respiratory relief whenever I had connected with the assembly. It was like, finally, this is, because the thing about it is what people don't recognize, not only do black people, we think about all these cases, lost a loved one, but the truth, the story, we lost all of it. It's been hidden and kept from us. And so a lot of what I want to do with this book is give this as a gift for a more complete story about exactly what happened to their loved one. It may not be the perfect story, but it's far more than the newspaper excerpts that they
Well, even if someone didn't know why their family left something,
Exactly.
there's a whole lot of the stories missing. Yeah, for me, I don't know where my joy is found. I find myself doing a lot of cooking so that I don't have to think about, various things. I can just figure out this recipe and what I can do with that. But there's a certain joy in trying to share these stories with a younger generation. So I'm teaching undergraduates at Morgan, and they're coming around gradually, but I'm finding that there's a bit of a resistance because they want to go to joy immediately. They don't want to deal with these tough stories. So they're saying, well, we don't want to deal with slavery, we don't want to deal with lynching, we don't want to deal with that. And I think they have to know some of this in order to appreciate the other side. So I'm still working away at working with that younger generation.
I'm encouraged by my students as well. And I'm glad my students are going to be engaging in some of this work. But I think in the story what's so important is that not only do we look at the figures who were involved, who were guilty for lynching activities, but I wanted to profile the heroine stories of black leaders, black women, and others who spoke out. Again, remember, because these records were hidden in these boxes for 90 years, the stories and the role of black people who stood up was also hidden. And we would never know about it. So for students who are reluctant about dealing with this history, how do we know about the heroes whose voices have been suppressed if we don't go through and deal with this trauma and these traumatic episodes?
And once they start seeing that, I think there still is that strain that was picked up by Kanye West a few years ago. Why do black people let themselves be slaves?
Yeah,
Kind of
mainstream.
And so I think there's a little of that.
Yeah.
Every time I give tours at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, I point out all the rebellions.
Yeah.
And you have to start with those kinds of things to show that there was always resistance.
Exactly.
We've been denied the truth about those stories.
Exactly.
And now it's our mission to find them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming out tonight. It was an illuminating, difficult, but a very much well-needed look at Maryland history. Everybody thinks about Prince George's County and how it's become the richest African-American county majority in the United States, but just across the Chesapeake, there is history, and there is even on our side. So thank you so much to everyone who's come out. For those of us tuning in via live stream, thank you for sticking with us. And you do have the opportunity to buy a signed book with shipping included to your home. And here tonight, we will have Dr. Chavis here to do a signing. So thank you once again, Dr. Chavis and Dr. Schiff, and have a lovely evening, everyone.